Thanks very much to the organizer, especially Wayne, for inviting me to come along. I spoke here also 2 years ago on a related topic, and I appreciate how Wayne sort of framed the sessions also in connection to the previous one. But I would like to start by actually getting deeper into what the session set out to do, and I just quote here a couple of lines which I think are very intriguing and decisive questions. And here the authors ask, what if we shift our focus from origins and endpoints to the journeys in between? The in between, I think, is key, to objects in transit. They further argue that ethnographic objects with their stretched out histories, layered relations, and multiple registers of value surely complicate, if not completely undermine, totalizing dichotomies of us and them. They open up to ongoing histories of connections. They reveal what lies between us and them. Is an entanglement that refuses a certain kind of foreclosure. And they ask, how can we develop a new vocabulary for addressing these relations and interactions? So what I would like to do is to make a very modest sort of conceptual contribution to that vocabulary, and I sort of base it on my own in-between position, because 2 weeks' time I will finish a book on years of research, so I'm very tired, on refocusing ethnographic museums through oceanic lenses. So I do not deny the ethnographic, I try to refocus by assuming a different lens, in that case oceanic lens. And on the other hand, just a few months ago I joined a museum and work inside a museum charged with putting that refocusing on practice, so I'm even more tired. So what I want to do here is in this chapter to create a sort of dialogue between the Pacific and Europe, and not just a dialogue between objects, but between different relationships to objects and different museologies. Because what I really think we need in Europe, we need intellectual and epistemic help from outside Europe if we really want to refocus or re-understand what the things we have in our collections might mean or will mean or meant or will mean again. On October 23, in 2017, the Free State of Saxony in Germany returned for the first time in its history ancestral remains, in this case Iwikupuna, to their descendants in place of origin, in this case Hawaii. These Iwikupuna were evidently stolen by German ship captains from burial caves in Hilo, Honolulu, and Waiale in the Hawaiian Islands between 1896 and 1902, and sold directly to the Königliches Zoologisches, Anthropologisches and Ethnographisches Museum in Dresden, what a title. There they became scientific specimens incorporated into the anthropological collection, which later, in 1957, formed part of the Museum for Volkenkunde Dresden. This museum belongs, since 2004, to the Staatliche Ethnographische Sammlung Sachsen, or SAS, my new employer, together with the Grassi Museum for Völkerkunde zu Leipzig and the Völkerkunde Museum Herrnhut, and since 2010 to the Staatliche Kunstsammlung Dresden, or SKD. So the whole conflict between art and ethnography plays here out as well. Winding back, when I began my fieldwork informing the book I will conceptually map in Hawaii in late 2014, so more than 3 years ago, I began by engaging with Noel Kahanu, who is seen in the book, and Edward Halealoa Ayau, then executive director of Huimalama Inakupuna o Hawaii Nei, a Hawaiian group devoted to the return of globally dispersed Iwikupuna, aware of this particular and seemingly unsolvable claim, which was first lodged in 1991, 26 years ago. In October 2017, 26 later, just 1 month after I started my new role as head of research at the Staatliche Ethnographische Sammlung Saxony, this ordeal finally found its positive conclusion. My involvement on the Saxonian side in making this happen was minimal, since my colleagues Nanette Snöp, Birgit Schepes-Brettschneider, and Vera Marusic had paved the way through the bureaucratic machinery for months before I joined the institution. It seemed like I was drawn into this historical juncture beyond my control, while I'm convinced that this remarkable constellation itself was no accident but the response to some higher calling. Noel would certainly support this point. It should go without saying that I unconditionally supported the course and took charge of much of the external correspondence with the Hawaiian side, with whom I was, quite ironically, more familiar. I made any effort post-conceivable that this historic event would run culturally safe, diplomatically appropriate, and importantly, intellectually stimulating or epistemologically valuable, and insisted that we should arrange a public roundtable discussion after the political act sealing the return of the iwi kupunua, so that museum staff and visitors could come along, meet, experience, listen, ask, and understand. Both sides, the state ethnographic collections in Hawaii, agreed to stage such an event. As we all know, ethnographic museums are increasingly discussed and contested institution in Germany, Europe, and beyond. The debate around issues such as the provenance of so-called ethnographic objects collected in colonial contexts and the restitution of illegitimately removed human remains to the descendants of the deceased are particularly intense. The debate, however, I would argue, often remains at the level of political opinion and lacks critical and productive interrogation. Restitution is often seen as an individual and final act, as an end in itself, which could even threaten the survival of museum collections and research. But what happens if we reconsider restitution itself as anthropological work, which allows us to delve deeper into the meanings of material entities and the life of things? What can be gained rather than lost if we approach restitution as an integral dimension of the museum as process through which ethnographic objects and human remains can be reconnected with the cultural environments of their source societies and customary sources of knowledge? In short, what new can we study, learn, and understand through the process of restitution due to their epistemological and ontological potentialities, while writing the next chapter of the ongoing relationship between here and there, us and them? Now, backwards. In April 2017, I attended a symposium under the title of Difficult Heritage, Colonial Objects, Postcolonial Knowledge at the Lind Museum, Stuttgart, which is one of the conferences Wayne actually attended. There I presented a paper on decentering European museums through transcultural collaborations, examples from Oceania, drawing on collaborative work conducted in Aotearoa, New Zealand with Sean Mellon and Nina Tonga, as well as Arapata Hakiwai and Conal McCarthy. I began by complicating the widespread notion of indigenous voice, which often seems to imply its addition to or inclusion into a conversation without necessarily reframing the rules under which the conversation is held. In other words, I wanted to move from the important political and ethical implications to the underlying and I think even more important indigenous ways of knowing and being from and through which political and ethical issues might arise. I argue that concept, method, and theory often remain the prerogative of so-called Western sciences, embodying the very core that needs to be decentered if one intends to dig deeper into the post-colonial knowledge of colonial objects, as the conference set out to achieve. How then can we create, or rather co-create, knowledge across epistemological and ontological boundaries? How can we allow difference in whatever form to redefine its term of analysis, whatever this might entail? How can we approach and understand indigenous material expressions without reducing them within intellectual frameworks developed elsewhere, that is, largely in the West? These are methodological questions that pose conceptual challenges. I responded by presenting methodological approach, the co-collecting of German Samoa, and by making a conceptual proposition, understanding the curator as the figure of the kaitiaki, or guardian. The next speaker in Stuttgart was Shiraj Rasool, who was also in the audience, so first brownie point here, who talked about the bumpy road towards the post-colonial museum. While listening to Shiraj, I found myself really agreeing with this notion of coloniality as an epistemology, as a politics of knowledge, which requires epistemic work aimed at the recovery of indigenous knowledge systems. At one point, however, when he used the term post-ethnographic, I felt myself suddenly resisting in a quite visceral way. Most intriguingly, during the discussion after our panel concluded, Wayne, also in the audience, intervened from the audience and probed our respective attitudes towards the ethnographic, since it seemed to him and myself that we were both diametrically opposed, pro, me, and contra Shiraj. Shiraj embraced the interrogation question and clarified that this argument did not announce the death of, but rather a particular engagement with the ethnographic museum. This entailed, he argued, thinking and working through the ethnographic museum not as a targeted point of arrival, but as a constant process of questioning. I found myself wholeheartedly agreeing again with two scholars I very much respect. It is precisely this ethos to which my current work is devoted, that is, the refocusing of ethnographic museums, in this case through oceanic lenses. So this work offers a multi-sided collaborative ethnographic investigation of indigenous knowledge practices in 3 Pacific museums located at the corners of the so-called Polynesian Triangle. The Bernice Pahaui Bishop Museum in Hawaii, the Museum of New Zealand, the Papatonga River, and the Museo Antropologico Padre Sebastian Englert in Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. From the late 18th century, the academic disciplines of anthropology or ethnology emerged through scientific exploration and colonial expansion beyond Europe and North America, as well as the establishment of ethnographic or ethnological collections in museums in Europe and North America. To this date, anthropology, ethnology, and the ethnographic, as we all know, remain complicated terms with different histories in different parts of the world. In my work, I opt for the terms anthropology and ethnographic because of their prevalence across the Pacific and internationally. While I critically interrogate rather than just rename these categories of history, I also, and I think that's important, opt for the ethnographic, just for a lack of a better word, as an omnipresent interpretive field and condition, as well as action, movement, and performance, through which difference, in whatever form, has been studied, understood, often misunderstood, governed, critiqued, subverted, and so on. So my argument is we can't go without the ethnographic. We might rename it. My aim then is to refocus rather than deny the ethnographic by decentering, multiplying, and undisciplining through oceanic lenses. So how did I do that? The research comprised 9 months of fieldwork between September and July 2016, and its objectives were achieved through a methodological triangulation of archival research, oral histories and narrative interviews, virtual and collection-based research, photography, as well as, and it's the key, thick participation throughout the entire research process. That is, the project was conducted with, rather than about the participants, thus representing a collaborative ethnography through which knowledge is co-produced, co-interpreted, and co-represented, as I now try to elaborate in more detail. The struggle over what in German is called Deutungsmacht, or the power of interpretation, which comes up at each conference, over the questions of who interprets whom and who speaks on behalf of whom, erupted in the 1980s, as we all know, in vigorous clashes caused by the crisis of ethnographic authority and the writing culture debate. As a response to the ongoing discussions about culture and representation induced by postmodern and postcolonial critiques, proponents of the ontological turn have argued, for example, for ontological delegation, which turns the anthropologist into an ontological negotiator or diplomat, or the ontological self-determination of the other, which redefines anthropology's role not as that of explaining the world of the other, but rather of multiplying our world. Yet despite these laudable suggestions emerging in the debate, one can note, and I quote, a relative absence of to date of a certain kinds of others, as Amiria Salmond has concluded, those who might consider themselves as native thinkers and might want to share a stage with these non-native thinkers to offer their own accounts of ontological struggle, of self-determination and decolonization. This virtual absence of indigenous scholars has prompted So Todd, for example, who identifies, and I might spell or pronounce it wrongly, as Metis Opetemisivi, an indigenous feminist from Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, to even claim that ontology is just another word of colonization or colonialism. My work responds to this predicament in a methodological way. As hinted at before, decolonization in former European colonies, as across the Pacific, has brought about drastic changes to museums and anthropological practices through indigenous interventions, which draw on indigenous ontological perspectives in order to reshape collecting, exhibiting, fieldwork, and research, often conducted in partnership with nearby communities. So-called ethnographic objects in Europe museums, however, remain largely alienated from the distant cultural environment of their indigenous producers and sources of knowledge. The core of the widely observable conflicts between Euro-American institutions and indigenous people is therefore even deeper, I would argue, and apart from the largely justified claims for moral redress, political concessions, and legal reparations, which tend to dominate museological debates, I see the problem as essentially methodological. That is, the desperate grip on Deutungsmacht, which continues to... Oh, now I'm confused. I need to chill out. That is, the desperate grip on Deutungsmacht, which continues to paralyze anthropological and museological discussions, is often not only politically and morally reprehensible, but methodologically flawed. I should get through this. To be sure, anthropological knowledge production has never been a linear affair, despite the undeniable power dynamics underpinning such a destructive process, colonialism. But there has been co-creation since the moment of first encounter, throughout the invention of anthropology to the formation of ethnographic collections in museums. These indigenous interventions might not have entered political or official perspectives at the time, but they still took place. Anthropological work has never been an exclusive business, but it has always relied on and had to engage with others as informants, negotiators, interlocutors, and so on. At the same time, we should not glorify the present situation in which co-creation seems to have become a trend, an almost fashionable must-have, at least in the museum world. Quite often, however, such initiatives can be unmasked as shallow political gestures which arguably lack methodological rigor and fail to address the key question I've tried to raise in my whole work. How can we seriously co-create knowledge across boundaries which do exist, however porous, malleable, and relationable they are? This is essentially, again, a methodological question. It seems to me that there are few approaches in current scholarship that are able to move beyond the orthodox self-other dichotomy. The persistent block appears to have caused the ontological turn to lose track, rather than setting course towards the muliwai, an Hawaiian concept of the own space in between people, things, and places, and knowledge across their global connection, as I argued with Noel Kohanu elsewhere. Articulating visions of anthropology's future, at least from an indigenous oceanic perspective, which is the focus of my work, however, according to Tai Tangen, is, can only be done, and I quote here, through genealogical work, the search for, production, and transformation of connections across time and space. The main concern should therefore not be how anthropology redefines the perceived difference of others, e.g., for example, in cultural or ontological terms, but rather how the anthropological inquiry itself is done with them. In my work, then, the focus is on a collaborative ethnography in the doing. Hawaiian scholar Manulani Meyer, a proponent of the accuracy and depth of indigenous epistemologies and knowledge systems, speaks of the Maliwai, a place where fresh water and salt water meet, where the river flows into the sea. It is a critical habitat where marine life congregates as the Muliwai ebbs and flows with the tide, changing shape and form daily and seasonally. In metaphorical terms, the Muliwai is a location and state of dissonance, where and when two potentially antagonistic elements meet. But it is not a space in between, rather it is its own space, a territory unique in each circumstance, depending on the size of the river and the width of the opening and the strength of recent hard rain. Rather than being a threat to encountering inhabitants, this living, breathing, and changing Muliwai is a source of life and potentiality. Anthropological knowledge production seems to me most meaningful if it captures and opens the location and the moments of the Muliwai as the own space of potentialities arising from in-between worlds. This might again be approached in ontological, cultural, or other terms. I opt here for the cultural, or rather cross-cultural, but more important than the label is the concrete empirical reality which it refers to. And that's the last page. What is much needed then is a conscious awareness of and constructive engagement with what might be termed the cross-cultural infrastructure of ethnographic knowledge. What I mean by this is that ethnographic authority can only be dialogically negotiated through a cross-cultural anthropology that is enacted not just through its analytical focus on cross-cultural action, traffic, and appropriation, as research increasingly does, but at the level of method, interpretation, and representation of the anthropological inquiry itself. Such conscious cross-cultural infrastructure of ethnographic knowledge must be put into practice and built through the translational dialectic of cross-cultural resonances and dissonances. Such serious cross-cultural study researches for resonances between differently culturally grounded analytical positions and their respective articulation and movement through a common sphere, while opening spaces for cross-cultural dissonances, which are provoked through the untranslatable. Cross-cultural dissonance become a cross-cultural finding throughout the process of collaborative anthropological inquiry, rather than inhibition from the outset caused through Euro-Americentric projection of anthropological imaginations. The own spaces resonating in between the Maliwai are insidiously fraught with dissonances. In my world, this methodological ethos was enacted at every stage and in each dimension of the collaborative anthropological inquiry, from question and method to interpretation and representation of writing. The deliberative sharing of analytical authority is given explicit expression through co-written chapters on Hawaii with Noel Kahanu, on Rapa Nui with Christian Moreno Pacarati and Mara Mulrooney, and on Aotearoa, New Zealand with Sean Mellon and Nina Tonga. These chapters and their underpinning research grew out of the fieldwork and emerged throughout our ongoing collaborative endeavors. Apart from its thematic content, the work complicates the notion of monograph, and that's the key here, and its claim of sole authorship. It reveals the underpinning and often hidden multiple anthropological relationships by critically revisiting the figure of the informant in the past and by methodologically executing anthropology as interlocution in the present. While books have been written on how to do collaborative ethnography, one can hardly detect examples which lift the collaborative approach to the level of co-interpretation and co-representation through co-writing. James Clifford's pondering on ethnographic authority in its suggestion of an alternate textual strategy that accords to collaborators not merely the status of independent enunciators, but that of writers still mostly remains a utopia of plural authorship. The anthropological potential, indeed necessity, as well as the limits of such polyphonic and utopian work lay at the heart of my current work. In museums, after all, it has become almost an orthodoxy to co-curate, whatever this might actually entail in terms of substance. So the question remains, how can we refocus the ethnographic, more broadly yet specific, through oceanic lenses? I can't offer more in terms of detail.